And I'd like to begin our conversation today with discussion of AI. So it's been a veritable buzzword this year, but rather than addressing it too broadly, I'd like to focus in the first instance on the importance of its accurate usage.
Yeah, no, this is, it's almost impossible not to talk about AI right now in our industry, isn't it? And actually, it's a great question because I think the use of AI in our industry, there's a lot of hope, expectation, but also a tinge of hype as well. Mm-hmm. And so I think from our perspective, the way that we're thinking about this is there are elements of where AI is useful already, and there's areas where AI is not yet ready for the mainstream. And you quite rightfully sort of called out generative AI as being the exciting area right now. AI is being used to capture a broad array of robotics, analytics, all the way up to generative AI. And it's worth just picking that apart slightly because I think there's value in some things that fall under this big catch-all. So starting with the areas where we believe there is great opportunity, we certainly see around base automation. So taking a repetitive task that humans do today, but not necessarily their favorite activity in any day, but are still costly and time consuming. And those are some of the areas which are really suit automation. So in our world, in clinical, back to our previous conversation, we have a TMF bot which captures the documentation around clinical studies, automatically categorizes it and puts it into the system. It's an important compliant job, but actually a human neither enjoys doing it but can't do it as well as a machine now. So actually it's perfect for automation. Another area where true generative AI is becoming particularly useful is as an assistant. And so there are technologies out there right now. I mean, just calling out ChatGPT as being one example of that from OpenAI, Microsoft, and the way that can be now integrated in with Teams to record the notes from a meeting, such as our conversation right now, where it would capture what you said, what I said, and could assign actions to each of us based on our conversation. That is a great thing. No one likes being the note taker in the meeting, and it's something that enables people to focus on what they're saying. However, even with that, there's a little risk in a compliant industry such as ours. So, and that's the catch with generative AI. Unlike machine learning or traditional analytics, you quite often can get into a situation where you don't know the genesis of the decision, and you can get a different answer from the same algorithm if you ask the same question twice. And that, of course, doesn't work with a compliant industry where you need to show consistency in your decisions to be able to make sure that you're making the right decisions. So let me give you an example of that. If a rep is meeting with a doctor and I'm using generative AI to capture it, and I don't check my notes, it could have caught the conversation incorrectly. And in doing so, it could have, instead of just talking about the drug within the bounds of what you're allowed to talk about it could capture a comment which could be taken incorrectly and be used as an example of bad behavior in an interaction. But once it's recorded, if it's not checked, it's then a discoverable item. So again, just being very careful, even on an innocuous thing like taking notes, there's a risk there. Now, if you take that forward into some of the other areas, if it's into true generative AI usage, there's opportunities potentially looking for drug candidates where you could potentially identify a particular pathway and a target protein, and that's one potential use. The advantage there is that can be checked by a human to see that you haven't gone catastrophically wrong. Another area where generative AI is not yet at the same level as machine learning is that we've used machine learning to be able to diagnose diseases effectively. And there are examples in place today, such as HIV. There was some interesting work done all around epilepsy as well, where you could codify what made a good diagnosis, and you could use it. And that was something that you can actually categorize as a medical device because it's repeatable. If you ask it the question, and then I ask it the question, it'll give you the same answer, so you can check it. So that works really well. But generative AI, if you're getting a different answer, that's risky. Because when generative AI gets it wrong, it can be catastrophically wrong. And unlike human beings, it doesn't have the notion of common sense. So from the spectrum of AI encapsulating automation through to true generative, I think there are examples of where it can be used, but there's cautions associated with it. And that then brings you on neatly into the next area of how can you make it better. The analytics, whether it's machine learning or generative AI, are totally reliant on the quality of the data that you give it. So if you look at open domain sources, you've got no control over that. And there were some great examples early on, which the training data taught the AI tools very bad behaviors, be those misogynist or racist, because that was the training data that it had. Now, what we see in our industry is you don't have that luxury. It's funny when it's in a newspaper article, it's really bad when it's a medicine. So in our world, actually high quality, harmonized data is really valuable. And so on the one hand, and the absolute extreme of treatments and suggestions for treatments, but even down to the notion of coming up with the next best action for a rep, what should they do next? And certainly where we see our role at Veeva is doing the grindy work, the hard bit of giving harmonized data, and then working with our partners for them to use their algorithms on top of it to help pharma companies where appropriate.
Okay, so if we talk about this grindy work and Veeva, where does this all apply and what's the impact of it within specialized or personalized medicine?
If you think about, and we've talked about this in the past, this sort of notion, and in fact, we heard it here at Summit with the panel with physicians. They actually want, physicians, KOLs want input from the industry. They want to understand what new treatments are, how to use them. They want medical education, but it's got to be useful. And each interaction has to be useful. And each interaction should build off the previous interaction, whether it was you talking to them first or me talking to them. Whoever goes next should be a step beyond where we each covered previously. And that's quite difficult. It's quite difficult unless you bring all the information about that interaction together, unless you understand that individual and what their journey is, what their level of interest, and you understand the information that you have available. So what we do is we make sure that the interaction data, whether it's with medical, clinical, or the field teams, is stored and managed in a consistent way. We take all of that body of information about physicians and make it available in one of our tools, Link, so that you can truly understand about that individual, what they're interested in, the sort of congresses they've been to, so you can form a picture of them. And then ultimately, that would be a great source of information to pull together with when you last saw them, what meetings they're going to, and come up with suggestions as to what the next interaction might look like or how you might do it. But all of that requires that you've got accurate, harmonized and consistent data so the algorithm can do its thing on top of it.
Absolutely. So we're talking not just clean data, but high quality data.
Yeah.
And you also went on there, I believe, to this notion that's coming in at the moment of inbound as well as outbound when it comes to engagement with HCPs. Perhaps you could expand on that slightly.
Yeah, this is a really interesting area. If you look at the generational muscle mass of the life sciences industry, it's created an industrial scale, a push mechanism for information. So if you're a physician, I go and see you, I talk about what I want to talk about to you. What we actually hear time and time again, and we heard it on stage here at Summit, was that physicians want to speak to those companies who have information that is incremental and useful to them. Mm-hmm. Now, the catch about the current model is that assumes that the visiting MSL or rep turns up at the right time. But actually, for that information to be useful for me, it needs to also be timely. And that may not be when a visit is planned. So, for example, if I've just seen a patient, I want to learn about new oncology treatments in a specific area, a specific tumor type, I need to be able to reach out proactively and find out if that information is there. And so this notion of pull becomes really important. And in fact, we've recently conducted a study where we found that where you make pull channels available so that the physician can actually ask for help, that makes up 30% of all interactions. And we've also seen that those interactions on average answered in about 5 minutes. So all of a sudden you've shifted the whole dynamic and you've become useful because you're actually addressing a real need. And then where we see that usage, we don't just see the pull channels go up, we also see all other channels go up because you've built a real dialogue with the individual.
So now I want to talk about value, because at the end of the day, it all comes down to money, or cost at least. Yeah. So can you tell us how medical will prove pivotal as scrutiny of value for money intensifies in Europe, for example?
Yeah, it's interesting because there was a McKinsey study shown that medical budgets haven't increased in the last 5 years. Counter to that, though, is the fact that when you speak to HCPs, they say they really value their interactions with medical because it provides educational information and new data on products that they may not otherwise have. So there's a bit of a gap there. So everyone's kind of known that medical was really useful and effective, but no one's been able to track it. So we've been using our data, our interaction data, to look at what the impact is. And what we've seen is that where MSLs are included pre-launch and used to heavily educate around a treatment 3 months or more in advance of the launch itself, we see an uplift of 1.5 times the prescription of that product, which is just huge. Now, on top of that, what we actually see is the stickiness of the product goes forward into the next year and a half, because you've actually set the market up properly. It's being used in the right way, so you're getting the right outcome, so it tends to be stickier. So it's very much this shift, especially as we move more towards 70% of treatments being in specialty or targeted treatments, making sure that the physician can match the right treatments to the right patients and then therefore get the outcomes.
Okay, so in short, it's about the sort of pressures that are abounding when it comes to biopharma demonstrating value for money alongside that clinical efficacy and, as you said, the adherence factor. Perhaps we can address the Viva Pulse findings that less than half of HCPs are now accessible. So if I give a little bit of history to the conversation we're going to be having, the Viva Pulse Field Trends report, which analyses over 600 million HCP interactions and activities annually from more than 80% of commercial biopharma field teams worldwide, its analysis compiles real-time transactional data recorded in Viva CRM and Viva Data products to deliver a view of engagement activity across the life sciences. Indexed by Viva Quarterly, the data aims to help companies effectively and accurately benchmark performance and to set the right actionable goals for continued growth and impact. But before we dive deeper into the recent report's findings, I thought it was interesting that PM Live earlier in the year reported that the new reality, so to speak, of HCP engagement is that HCPs have more options than ever before. And for many in the industry, this has made cutting through the noise in the online space a significant challenge. Turning now to the Viva Pulse Field Trends report, this has recently found that HCP access has returned, one can perhaps say unfortunately, to its pre-pandemic state, with only 45% of HCPs accessible to biopharmas now. That's compared to 60% a mere 18 months ago. And half of HCPs are more selective across specialties, which exacerbates the problem, restricting engagement to 3 or fewer companies. Indeed, according to the report, immunology and dermatology seem to be the most accessible at the moment, while internal medicine and psychiatry are some way behind. So, despite access challenges, some field teams, though, are extending HCP relationships by becoming one importantly connected resource across sales, marketing and medical in order to build more relevant and trusted relationships, an important word, that trust. In other words, coordinated engagement modelling. So Chris, after all that preamble, can you tell us more about this trend?
Well, first of all, great summary.
Thank you.
I think what we're really seeing is exactly as you said. Going into the pandemic, we were seeing these kind of numbers. Half of all doctors not taking any visits from pharmaceutical companies, and of those, the vast majority speaking to 3 or fewer. That obviously dropped off a cliff when the pandemic happened, and we saw a pickup in digital engagement. And then when people were allowed to reconnect again, there was a spike whilst doctors and pharmaceutical companies reconnected. And we've seen it return pretty much to exactly where it was before. If you remember back from when we were here in Madrid in November, and we saw the panel of doctors, I thought they summarized it beautifully. So in their words, what they look at is they need information on how to treat their patients. They need to know which treatments are available and whether they're applicable, but they need to sometimes know that almost in real time. And they're looking for true education. So I think when you pick apart those numbers and see what sits behind it, what you're really seeing is those that add value in that relationship are actually sought after. But those that have a superficial message, or the key thing that we heard from that panel was that the most frustrating thing is if they get interactions with companies that don't build off the previous one, and it's just hammering the same point over and over again. So that then starts to point to, if you can add value in the relationship, and if there's true education, and if each interaction builds off the last one, then you are seeing access levels. But pharmaceutical companies have to be aware that those doctors are being very selective, and they are going to get limited chances of building that trust. And when they do, they're going to have to maintain it.
Exactly. And knowing this right way to approach the HCPs and deliver a personalised approach, this all depends on data, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And you touched on some really great examples in your intro. So we've heard from our customers, for example, that they've had instances where they've been conducting clinical trials with real leaders in the field in a particular therapeutic area. And then to have their medical service leads come in and talk to those same doctors, and to not know that they were on their clinical studies. And that's why that linkage between clinical and medical is so important, because there's only so many experts, especially as we move into specialty and rare and ultra rare diseases. And so having strong relationships with them and building off that foundation is important. The other thing that we're seeing is that when you have those interactions, they do need to be tailored to the individual, and that's quite difficult today. So what we're looking at is how can we combine sales, marketing and medical, so that with input from clinical, to understand who we've spoken to, about what, and what did they value, and how do they want to be communicated with, i.e. in person, digital or mixture. And then the final element is there was always this notion that it was a push message. So pharmaceutical companies would reach out to doctors and it would all be about, right, okay, I want to tell you about. Actually, what we hear from physicians is, no, sometimes there's time when I need to know the answer to, is this drug right for my patient? Under what circumstances? What can you tell me? Can you help me with this? And there, what we've been doing is experimenting with two-way chat. And with compliant chat, we're seeing 30% of all those interactions actually triggered by physicians who have a question, need it answered, and want it answered pretty quickly. And again, all of that builds this circle of trust, especially if you understand every interaction and can build off it.
Circle of trust, two-way chat, basically the very nature of a human relationship.
There's so many companies and they're targeting some fairly specialist areas. And doctors are human beings and they will focus their efforts on those where they feel that they get the most value. And that means that every interaction is precious and it has to add value. Absolutely.
So if we think about this notion and perhaps what might exist geographically differently when it comes to HCP access, considering the global trends now and taking into consideration the US, as well as Europe, Asia, but also Latin America. For instance, Latin America was found to have the lowest average meeting duration of all regions. Can you perhaps tell us why there is this discrepancy between the connectivity, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at this across markets, in some places it's easier to understand than others. So, for example, as we look into markets like the UK, where you've got a lot of collective agreements and you go through healthcare trusts, the direct interaction with physicians is even more limited, and they're even more selective about who they talk to. And we're seeing those discrepancies across all markets, almost with the US being the benchmark, and places like Latin America are even lower, where you've got high prevalence of specialty medicine. That's where you tend to see where there's new and innovative treatments. That's where you tend to see more engagement because the doctors need to understand the treatments and how to use them. So I think what's interesting is, yes, we see discrepancies by markets. That could be cultural, it could be product mix. But equally, we're seeing that the core trend almost goes up and down in unison. And it's this combination of value in every interaction, building off the previous one, and the mix of channels that suits the individual, including two-way.
Mm-hmm. So you've spoken a lot about education during this conversation. So if we think pre-launch, what role can education of KOLs or field medical key opinion leaders play in facilitating matters? We've seen that if you target and provide support to those KOLs 6 months or more before launch, differential outcomes, both in terms of initial prescriptions, but really interestingly, the maintenance of those prescriptions, so the adherence to it going forward. And if you take a step back and just look at it from a logical perspective, it kind of makes sense. If you're educating the market to how it should be used, when it should be used, what are the right patient sets, you're going to get better outcomes.
And those KOLs are so important to educating the medical community as a whole. So understanding who they are, understanding how they like to communicate, and understanding any track record or history does what we touched on previously, which is building that trust-based relationship. And so what we're seeing is those companies that understand and target that get considerably better differential outcomes.
Now, is there a takeaway from our conversation, something that can be summarized in maybe not one sentence, but a couple of sentences?
Yeah, I think it's this core theme of every interaction has to matter, and it should build off the previous one. So our advice to all of our customers is to look very carefully at the needs of your key opinion leaders and physicians, and make sure you're directly targeting their needs in their context, in the way that they want to be communicated with. And in doing that, when you take the perspective of that doctor, they lead very busy lives, they're doing important work treating patients, and you're giving them the data in a form that's consumable and useful in the context of what they're doing, not in some kind of mass email or mass splurge. So that targeting is everything.
Targeting is everything.
Yeah.
I'll take that as your summation. Thank you very much, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Nicole.